Welcome to the Leadership by Design podcast, where thoughtful leaders share lessons from their journey. I'm Dave Adams, founder of the Business Freedom Group. Today, we're very pleased to have Dan Woods with us. Welcome, Dan, and I'd love to start off with you telling our audience a little bit about yourself, your professional activity, the wonderful and unique journey you've had.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate being here today. So my background is in tech and in content creation, writing. I always was interested in writing and always was doing freelance journalism of some sort. My first 2 years of college were, spent in humanities, but then I realized this was way back in the 70s. I realized that computers were going to be a big thing. And so I switched and became a computer science major. I then had a career doing MBS system programming, software development, and then went to journalism school. And in journalism school, I did a 1-year program at Columbia and then came out and covered banking in a newsroom in New Jersey for 3 years. And then I did data journalism in North Carolina for 3 years, then came back to tech. And so in tech, I worked at Time Inc. I was CTO of a couple of startups, and that took us to the end of the dot-com era where I thought, okay, I've spent about 6 years in startups. I realized, why not take this opportunity to reinvent myself and combine my real technology experience as a CTO and my real writing experience as a journalist. And by that time, I had written my first book called The Developer's Guide to the Java Web Server, because we had used the Java Web Server at Time Inc. And so I thought, you know what, it's time to do that. So I put out a bunch of book proposals to publishers, and that led to an engagement to write 2 books for SAP, who was interested in getting more into Silicon Valley. O'Reilly, the tech publisher, hooked me up with SAP. I wrote 2 books for them. And I started in 2003, most of my first contracts. And since then, I've been doing the exact same thing, which is working with companies that have advanced technology to help tell their stories in an understandable way and express their value proposition and educate people, usually about the mechanisms that achieve their value. Engineers can write really well for other engineers. The reason I've had a business this long is that it's hard to find people who can write about the real mechanisms of the technology for a broader audience. Because in the tech world, and this only has gotten worse over the past, 10 or 15 years, everybody hates marketing.
Right.
And that's because people find that it's useless communication. What everybody loves is education. And so the only truly effective marketing for a advanced technology company is to educate people about what you're learning about how to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And so the form that my content takes has been books. We've done more than 30 books. We've done white papers galore, creative assets like comic books, lots of visual assets. And it's always about helping people understand who they are and what they have to teach the world. And then lately that's taken a different form as AI has changed content creation. But I'm sure we'll get into that.
Well, and I think you also said that a good bit of what is brought into those, a lot of times the story of the company is a little bit the story of the founder. So I'm sure you've been exposed to good, the bad, and the ugly in from a leadership standpoint. And
Every technology company has a hero's journey inside it. And there's always a moment where a person or a group of people realized that there was a fascinating problem that they understood a lot about, and it would be great if somebody created a solution, and they decided they had the passion to create it. Now, even when you get to a situation where you're on your 3rd or 4th CEO, if, that same hero story is relevant and that same passion, should be energizing the company. And so you're right that the hero story is really important. And then the other part of it is that you are learning about how to solve the problem. And then as the journey proceeds, your understanding of the problem deepens. And also you encounter different people who are coming at you. And of course, the Jeffrey Moore, analysis of crossing the chasm, teaches us a lot about, the first people you encounter are the experts who just want to know how it works. They're going to put it to work. They don't need your help. The next people that you encounter are the people who have a problem but don't know how to solve it, and you need to teach them how to solve it. And then later on, you get the people who are more conservative that only want to solve problems with technology that is well proven.
That describes the type of people you run across on the outside. Is there a similar model to what journey happens on the inside of the organization?
I've been doing a lot of work to try to figure out how to organize the storytelling inside an organization. And what I've realized is that, yes, there are different people playing different roles in helping to try to craft and tell the story. And often there is a missing role that will act to actually help crystallize how to tell that story. So let me just lay out a scenario for you that is pretty familiar in tech companies. It's not at all unusual for tech companies to encounter a group of users to make a product that make them happy, and then to realize that we've now sort of run out of those users and we found a bunch of new users that are coming to us for different reasons. And it often takes them a while to understand that. And so like one classic example I heard was a company that was all about planning software, and the planning software was replacing spreadsheet. Their message was replace the horrible complex spreadsheet with a much better solution. Well, they sort of had people who were spreadsheet jockeys they were selling to who hated, doing that. But then as they became more successful, people came to them to say, if we just did a better job of planning, we would transform our business. So they had to learn to sell, not replace your crappy spreadsheet, but create a better business. Mm-hmm. And so now when you change a message like that, you have to understand who you're talking to. And, there's great frameworks out there like the Jobs to Be Done framework that help you understand exactly the pain that people have and how to address it. But at some point, you sit together with a bunch of people, you hopefully do a bunch of research with the people you're trying to sell to, and you create a document of some sort. That's often used at the sales kickoff. And that message document, has the market context you discuss the personas, you discuss their specific needs, you discuss your product capabilities, and you create this distilled document, often, a white paper or a long deck, and it has all of that condensed. Mm-hmm. You give that to the sales staff, they see it, but they weren't there during all those discussions. And you give it to the social media team, you give it to corporate communications, and they see that some work was done to do this, and they try to master it, but they never get it because they never get all of the context surrounding it. In addition, they don't get it in the form that they should have it in to do their jobs. Well, I studied how things are done in theater, and I realized that the tech world could learn a lot from theater and solve all these problems. And so here's how it works in theater. Even the most dictatorial theater director or movie director is highly collaborative. They're working with the writer, they're working with the costume designers, they're working with the actors, they're working with the cinematographer, they're working with everybody to try to figure out how to tell the story better. And they're not just saying to the cinematographer, you do it this way. They're saying, how should we do it? They're saying, they ask that to everybody, and then there's a collaboration. And that collaboration sometimes changes the script, sometimes changes the way it's filmed, sometimes changes the stage. And then in theater, they have tryouts where they try it out and they make it better. And big changes happen in tryouts. And then it becomes crystallized into a form, that's then the movie or the play. Well, in tech, what happens is you need that person. You need that director. At first, you need the director to establish the context, and then you need the director to go around and ask everybody else what they think of the messaging that you're proposing. Then you go back, and also how they want to consume it. Then you go back and you create a much bigger document. I call it message enablement. And then the director then goes around and makes sure that everybody gets it in the form they need. And then you have true mastery of messaging. So the problem is that nobody's got the juice to play that role. Like product marketing can't go and demand collaboration with everybody. And often they don't want to collaborate about it. They think they got the messaging right, on their own. Of course, senior executives want to have a role in messaging, but they don't necessarily want to meet with everybody about teaching them how to do it. And so I think that the director level role could solve a lot of problems. And then you'd have true mastery of messaging. Now, of course, true mastery of messaging doesn't mean it works. Then you go on and you do like the out-of-town tryout. You have to then see how well
the soft opening, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing about it with a tech company, you're never done. You're always evolving it. It's never like it's crystallized with a movie or a play. And then there's director's notes and stuff like that about how to do it. But so, I guess you asked who are in all these companies. Well, I would say this is an answer. Who's not in these companies and who's not is this director role. Now, of course, this is made up for by dynamic leadership. You could argue that Steve Jobs played this role, at Apple. Sure. You could argue that, Brian Chesky played this role at Airbnb. Strong leaders tend to fill this role in. It could easily be institutionalized and it would make messaging much more effective. And then, of course, once you have good messaging, the content becomes way better, and the marketing becomes hopefully way better. But at least if it's not better, you're going out and consistently testing the message, not just testing creative.
So, I get completely that the charismatic leader can play that role and often does. But I'm also wondering at what point is a company really ready to step into that? Because you have these growing companies, right? And they're in adoption curves with various users and all that sort of stuff. So when does a company break out of sort of the ad hoc strap it together model and is really ready for a coordinated messaging effort like what you're talking about?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with, the classic idea of product market fit, because messaging assumes that you're selling a specific thing and that people want it. And, a marketer told me recently that, you're really in marketing not trying to create demand, you're trying to meet demand. And product market fit is all about trying to identify the demand that is out there to meet. Creating demand is a really hard job. Creating demand really means that your timing is wrong, if that's what you have to do.
Right.
Unless you want to be a very boutique type, place that just does a specific thing. So I would say that the stronger product market fit, the more well understood that is, the more messaging will be effective, because you will have done the foundational work, which is understanding who you're serving and how you're serving them,
Right.
And
I'd love to get your off-the-cuff reaction to my favorite messaging framework. So, I'm sure that you've been well exposed to the whole neuromarketing stuff, pain, claim, gain, right? And then there was a gentleman in Chicago who tacked something on the front of it, AIM. So you would state what you believe the aspirational aim of the client is, where they want to go, then what's the pain getting in their way, then your claim to how you help with that pain, and then their gain of what they get by working with you. It's no accident that 3 out of the 4 are about the customer. Only 1 out of the 4 is, aren't we beautiful? Here's what we provide. So what's your reaction to that sort of, it's formulaic, but I've found it helps a lot of engineer techie types kind of wrap their brain around.
Right. Well, what I think is very powerful about it is that just like the jobs to be done, framework, is that it encourages you to spend as much time as possible in the problem space. I think the engineers and entrepreneurs often become enamored of staying in the solution space because it's much easier and it's much more comfortable. That framework that you said helps you stay close to the problem space, which is what are your users struggling with. Pivots are all about when you realize you were wrong. I thought the problem was this, but it turns out, no, it's not. It's something else. And so pivots are essentially, failures of product market fit that you, instead of giving up, you decided to try again. So
Right. Now, obviously the whole AI thing is sort of a big umbrella trend that's going on. What trends do you see in your work that are giving leaders, pause or heartburn or whatever, whether it's part of AI or part of a longer trend?
Well, I think that the idea that I'm working on with a client about that I think helps really frame it is that, what you're really trying to do is recreate the same sort of labor arbitrage, automation arbitrage that was created by nearshoring and offshoring. But the characteristics are far different. So nearshoring and offshoring were about defined processes that you then handed to somebody else with very specific rules about how they were going to execute it and metrics about how well they were going to do. And it was generally, in the Jeffrey Moore parlance again, it was generally context activities, meaning the core you were doing yourself. That's the core value creating thing that nobody else could do. The context you would then offshore and nearshore. Well, AI now has changed that because the power of the automation is so large that it's applicable to the core in, idiosyncratic ways and also applicable to the context. And it's not easy to understand this new what's possible. So the progression that I think it makes the most sense is first try to just experiment, in a disciplined way about, high value problems and create digital assistants, co-pilots and see if you can understand what's possible by doing that. Some of them will succeed, some of them will fail. And then you have to find a way to push those into a deployable environment that has governance and security. Everybody's offering that now. Here, build your agents and put them into our framework. Now, some of the frameworks are all about the orchestration of the agents, and some of the frameworks are all about the presentation of the data and the APIs, and lots of overlap and things like that. So everybody's trying to offer different things, but that's the first step. Digital copilots that are deployable through in some safe governance framework. Great. Okay. Now, the next thing is to go from digital assistants or copilots to digital workers or autopilots. So now, and the lessons of the business process reengineering wave apply there, and which is, okay, let's not be frozen to the current process structure. Let's rethink things based on what's possible now and create a digital worker that can do a multi-step process, with human intervention where it's needed. And so then you've now, if you do it the right way, you've now not been locked into just doing process steps, but you have some bigger victories with a more autonomous process. Now, I read an interesting article from a guy at Sequoia who talked about how companies who sell copilots, usually the copilots get stronger and better, and then they'll be able to become autopilots. But if you're selling to somebody a copilot, and then now you're saying, now let's sell you an autopilot so you don't have to do this task anymore, that can be a jarring transition. But if you're doing this yourself, if you're creating your own digital shore, then you're happy to find an autopilot. And then, of course, that has to be deployable, and you're going to learn new things about operating autonomous processes and require different guardrails. And if you're in a highly compliant industry, maybe you find that you can't use the LLMs, the public LLMs, because they're not transparent enough. There's huge amounts of models available to be used, on premise. And so maybe that's what you have to do. So then, a bunch of digital workers become a digital shore, and then hopefully you're not just doing this randomly, but hopefully it's being driven by the priorities of your business strategy. And then as time goes on, your operational landscape becomes more and more mature. And usually that's probably going to be a combination of a different, 2 or 3 platforms. It's unlikely that any one company is going to be perfectly served by, just one of these agent platforms. Maybe there's one, for different purposes. And so I think that it's more of a team sport than I think people are realizing. And in addition, even though it's a team sport, there is room for like a lab skunkworks type function, so that when somebody finds something that seems to be working, then a bunch of higher skilled technologists can come in and rapidly, create it and harden it and deploy it, because.
I was speaking to someone the other day, and they put all of these AI possibilities into 4 buckets. And I thought that was an interesting framework. They were like, you can use AI to go meet new customers. You can use it to deepen the relationship with the customers you have. You can use it to deliver better on what you've sold, and then you can also use it to run smarter on your internal processes. And they said that they were finding people are kind of lining up, and like you said, depending on the priorities of their business, putting it in one of those buckets.
I think that's sort of another way of like saying that it should be driven by your business strategy, and one of those to that company is probably going to be the most important thing,
Right.
And so you can focus your energies there for.
What would you say is the biggest leadership challenge that people are facing these days?
I think that the fear that people have of the typical technology fear of like, how am I going to learn this? What does it mean to me? And then the second technology fear, which is now much more present, is, am I going to be replaced? And so, this is where I think as a country, I think we're better able to deal with those 2 fears than most other places on earth, because Americans are used to dealing with uncertainty and also taking action in a dynamic environment where you don't really know the outcome. You can only stay afraid so long, and then it's time to get busy and do stuff. And I think that, the reason we have the dynamic startup culture, the reason we have such a dynamic, investing culture, is because people have learned to master those fears and to take action in the face of them. Like that's what Mark Twain's definition of courage is. Courage is not the absence of fear; it's the ability to take action in the face of fear. And so I think that the leadership challenge is to help people get there. We don't know how this is going to work out. We're trying to reinvent ourselves. We're trying to do better. And it's exciting because it might not work out. But, on the other hand, if we all pull together, then I think, we can beat the other guys, which before AI, that's what you were trying to do anyway. It's not like it's just AI now means everybody's got an AI shovel and trying to use it. It's not like you weren't in a competitive, dynamic threatening
Right.
situations before that. And it's just that maybe it seemed a little bit safer.
Well, I grew up in the age of factory automation, and there was the great fear of loss through that. And, I think it's quite well proven that the people who win in times of change are the people who try to do more, not the people who try to cost reduce themselves and do the same. I loved in my executive MBA, I had a professor walk in, and her opening line was, I have a PhD in accounting, and I'm here to tell you I've never seen a company shrink to greatness. I just love that, So, well, I love how you talked about, the current environment really has to be addressed as a team sport, and that fear is the enemy, collaboration is the goal, and figuring out what you're going to do, like you just said. That's great. So, do you have any particular piece of advice that you would give to the leaders of small and medium-sized organizations that would be an actionable step they should take in the next 90 days?
Agentic engineering, vibe coding, and two of them are quite interesting. Boris Cherny of Anthropic, the head of Claude Code, and Simon Willison, he's an open source guru, but both have said that coding has been solved. You see the people who spend their lives coding, and now they say they only code by describing to AI what they want written. Now, of course, that description takes place in the context of a set of coding standards, a set of software testing, a build cycle, a whole repository of existing code. And then inside that well-structured environment, you can then talk about the end of coding because now you can describe it. And of course, so software engineering is very friendly to AI because it's got the software runs or it didn't. It meets the requirements or it doesn't. Not everything's like that. But both of them said also that they had been surprised that the mistake they made was not trusting enough in the AI. When they asked it to do more, it almost always was able to do more, and they were surprised. So why didn't I ask it to do more earlier? To me, the lesson that I'm taking away from that is that we are all headed toward the end of coding in each of our realms, and we will get there faster if we understand how to create the structure that surrounds the work we're doing to provide AI to be the knowledge and guardrails it needs to be successful. And we should be thinking of how to do experiments where we let AI rip more than we think it can do. Let's not be the ones who are saying no to what AI can do. Let's let it go. The arrival of artificial general intelligence. That to me is a very exaggerated point in time because anybody who does hard work of any sort can now do way more work than they ever could because they're using whatever we call AI right now, artificial specific intelligence. And the artificial specific intelligence goes beyond what we can do most people can do in most realms. And so we're already there to this world of AI really being able to do tremendous amounts for us. And whether or not it has a brain and a consciousness and a soul, which is sort of the assertion of the artificial general intelligence, isn't really that relevant. Who cares if it never happens? Because we've got this massive world to help us along. And then I think that the leadership is to understand where you want to focus and who you want to be, and then to try to create the end of coding for yourself by building all of the structural, the harness, as sometimes they call it, to handle that context so that then you can let AI rip. And I've just found that I do usually write a first draft myself, but then I use AI in multiple ways to try to get more research, to get more ideas, to play around with style. And then there's this massive kind of like body parts on the table from different experiments I've done. And then when I knit those together, I get a story or a piece of content that I was never going to prompt my way into. It's a true collaboration.
Well, you got some great insights there, from dream big, ask more, experiment more, to I loved your cultural reflections that, America's uniquely suited to deal with the chaos that's currently, ensuing. So thank you, Dan. It was a real pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you again for tuning in to Leadership by Design, to keep your thinking fresh with lessons from thoughtful leaders like Dan. All right. See you all next time.